The autumn air carried a slight chill as Augustus McBride made his way through Atlanta's Piedmont Park. His measured steps, slowed by age but still carrying military precision, took him along the familiar path he walked every morning. At 78, McBride's tall frame remained straight, his white hair cropped close, old habits from his Army days that never faded. 20 yards away, a group of college students huddled around a bench, their voices carrying fragments of conversation about police reform and equality. McBride observed them without turning his head, a skill honed during his reconnaissance missions in World War II. Their passion reminded him of his own youth, of battles fought both in Europe and back home. He paused near the lake, his reflection rippling in the water. His mind drifted to 1944, to the fields of France, where he served in the segregated 92nd Infantry Division. They called themselves the Buffalo Soldiers, fighting for a country that didn't fight for them. The irony wasn't lost on McBride, even now. Officer Tyler Evans sat in his patrol car at the park's entrance, his partner, Officer Davidson, scrolling through his phone beside him. Evans watched McBride through narrowed eyes, his jaw clenching rhythmically. "Look at him," Evans muttered, "acting like he owns the place." Davidson glanced up briefly but said nothing, used to Evans's daily commentary. Evans had been on the force for 12 years, his record marked with civilian complaints that somehow never stuck. His father and grandfather had been Atlanta police officers before him, and he carried their outdated views like a badge of honor. The sight of McBride, wearing his veteran's cap and walking with dignity, made Evans's skin crawl. "These old-timers think they're untouchable," Evans continued, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. "Military service doesn't make them special." He watched as McBride stopped to help a young mother retrieve her child's dropped toy. The simple act of kindness seemed to anger Evans further. The confrontation began with Evans exiting his patrol car, leaving Davidson behind. His heavy boots crunched on the gravel path as he approached McBride. The veteran's shoulders tensed slightly, another old survival instinct, but he continued his walk, attempting to ignore the officer's presence. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Evans called out, his voice carrying the false authority of a man drunk on power. McBride stopped, turning slowly to face him. The students nearby fell silent, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. What followed happened in a matter of minutes, but would be replayed countless times in the days to come. Evans's aggressive questioning, McBride's dignified responses, the escalation that no one expected but everyone feared. The first shove came without warning, sending McBride stumbling backward. Even then, the veteran maintained his composure, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. The second push was harder, followed by a strike that brought McBride to his knees. The students gasped, phones raised to record what had become an assault. Evans's rage seemed to feed off their horror, his actions growing more violent. He grabbed McBride's veteran's cap, throwing it in the mud before forcing the elderly man face down onto the path. The final moments of the assault saw McBride handcuffed, his cheek pressed against the cold ground, while Evans knelt on his back. The veteran made no sound, his silence more powerful than any protest. Nearby, the young activists who had been discussing change now witnessed firsthand why their fight was necessary. One of them, hands shaking, continued to film as Evans finally pulled McBride to his feet, the veteran's normally immaculate clothes now covered in dirt and blood. The incident lasted less than 10 minutes, but its impact would echo far beyond the confines of Piedmont Park. As Evans led McBride to the patrol car, the veteran's eyes met those of the young activists. In that moment, a connection was formed, a bridge between generations of struggle, a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. The video of McBride's assault spread across social media platforms with the speed and force of a wildfire. Sarah Chen, the college student who recorded the incident, uploaded it with trembling hands minutes after Evans departed. By nightfall, the footage had been viewed millions of times, each share accompanied by expressions of outrage and calls for justice. In the emergency room of Grady Memorial Hospital, doctors treated McBride for multiple injuries: 3 bruised ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and various cuts and abrasions that mapped Evans's brutality across his body. The attending physician, Dr. Rodriguez, documented each injury meticulously, knowing the report would likely become evidence. "Mr. McBride, you should stay overnight for observation," Dr. Rodriguez suggested, but McBride shook his head, his military stubbornness evident even through his pain. Before further discussion could occur, the hospital corridor filled with familiar faces. James Wilson, who had served alongside McBride in the 92nd Infantry, arrived first. Despite his own advanced age, he moved quickly through the hospital doors, his wife Margaret struggling to keep pace. Behind them came 3 more veterans, all members of McBride's weekly coffee group. They gathered around his bed, their presence a silent shield against the chaos unfolding outside. "The whole country's seeing it, Gus," Wilson said, his weathered hand gripping McBride's. "They can't sweep this one under the rug." The other veterans nodded, their expressions a mixture of anger and determination. They had all faced discrimination in their time, but seeing it captured so brutally on video stirred something deep within them. Meanwhile, in a suburban home 20 miles away, Samantha McBride sat frozen before her television. The news played the footage on repeat, though they blurred the most violent moments. She recognized her father's veteran's cap in the mud, the same one she had given him last Veterans Day. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. Samantha's relationship with her father had grown distant over the years. After her mother's death, she had pulled away, focusing on her career as a corporate lawyer. She had always respected her father's activism, but chose a different path, preferring to work within the system rather than challenge it directly. The reporter on screen interviewed witnesses from the park. The college students spoke with passionate indignation, while older park-goers described McBride as a fixture of the community, known for his morning walks and friendly demeanor. Each testimony twisted the knife deeper in Samantha's conscience. Local civil rights organizations are calling for Officer Evans' immediate termination, the reporter continued. The police department has placed him on administrative leave pending investigation, but protesters are already gathering outside police headquarters, demanding more decisive action. Samantha's colleague called, asking if she planned to represent her father in the inevitable legal proceedings. She let it go to voicemail. The thought of facing him now, after years of minimal contact, filled her with shame. She had built her career helping corporations navigate legal challenges, while her father continued fighting for real change. The footage played again, her father on the ground, Evans's knee on his back, the veteran's cap in the mud. Each replay forced Samantha to confront her own complacency. She had chosen comfort over conviction, stability over struggle. Now, watching her father endure what he had fought against his entire life, her carefully constructed walls began to crumble. As night fell, social media exploded with new hashtags. Justice for McBride, Veteran Lives Matter, Just Fire Evans. The video had struck a nerve, combining issues of police brutality, racial injustice, and disrespect for military service into a perfect storm of public outrage. Reporters camped outside the hospital, waiting for statements from McBride or his family. In her living room, Samantha finally picked up her phone. She scrolled through dozens of messages until she found her father's number. Her finger hovered over the call button as the news anchor's voice provided background noise. This incident has reignited debates about police reform and racial justice in our city. The question now is, will this be the catalyst for real change? As protests erupted across Atlanta, Augustus McBride watched from his hospital bed as history seemed to repeat itself. On the small TV mounted to the wall, aerial footage showed crowds gathering at multiple locations. the police headquarters, City Hall, and the park where the assault occurred. The signs they carried bore his name alongside calls for justice that echoed those he had heard decades ago. During quiet moments between nurse visits, McBride's mind drifted to 1944. He remembered the segregated barracks in Fort Huachuca, where the 92nd Infantry Division trained before deployment. Despite wearing the same uniform and fighting the same enemy, black soldiers faced discrimination from their own military. The irony of fighting fascism abroad while enduring racism at home wasn't lost on any of them. The door opened, interrupting his thoughts. Robert "Blue" Thompson, his radio operator from the war, entered the room using a walker. At 97, Blue moved slowly, but his mind remained sharp. He carried a worn leather photo album under his arm. "Thought these might lift your spirits, Gus," Blue said, settling into the chair beside the bed. He opened the album, revealing yellowed photographs of young soldiers in uniform. "Remember that night in Tuscany, when we proved we could fight just as well as any other unit?" McBride nodded, recalling the fierce battle where their unit held a strategic position against German forces. They had won commendations for their bravery, though the recognition came decades later. "We fought 2 wars, Blue, one against the enemy and one against prejudice. And here we are, still fighting," Blue replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "But something's different this time. The whole world is watching. They can't ignore it anymore." Outside the hospital, the crowd of supporters had grown. Young activists mixed with veterans, their combined voices creating a powerful chorus of protest. Some carried American flags alongside Black Lives Matter banners, bridging generations of civil rights struggles. The afternoon brought a visit from McBride's daughter, Samantha. She stood in the doorway hesitantly, her corporate attire contrasting sharply with the protest signs visible through the window. Their eyes met, and the weight of unspoken words filled the room. "Dad," she began, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm sorry. I should have been here sooner." McBride extended his hand, and she crossed the room to take it, noting the bruises that still marked his skin. "I've been watching the news," she continued, sinking into the chair Blue had vacated earlier. "People are angry. They're demanding change. But all I can think about is how I've stayed silent while you kept fighting." McBride squeezed her hand gently. "Everyone finds their own way to fight, Samantha. You chose law because you believed in working within the system. There's no shame in that." "But what has it really changed?" she asked, gesturing toward the window where protesters' chants could be heard. "I've spent years helping corporations navigate regulations while you've been out here, still fighting the same battles you fought in the 40s. Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse bringing medication. On the TV, a reporter interviewed young protesters who spoke about McBride's military service and his ongoing civil rights work. They called him a symbol of resistance, a bridge between past and present struggles. "These young people," McBride said, watching the screen, "they understand something that took us years to learn. The fight for justice isn't just about one incident or one person. It's about changing the system itself." Samantha looked at her father, seeing not just the injured man in the hospital bed, but the soldier who had fought fascism, the activist who had marched for civil rights, and the father who had never stopped believing in the possibility of change. "Teach me," she said finally, her voice firm with newfound purpose. "Teach me how to fight the right way." McBride smiled, recognizing in his daughter's eyes the same determination he had seen in countless young activists over the years. The movement was growing, evolving, and finding new voices to carry forward the eternal struggle for justice. Tyler Evans sat at his parents' dining room table, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. His mother, Margaret Evans, stood by the kitchen counter, unable to look directly at her son. His father, retired Police Sergeant James Evans, paced the room, his face a mask of barely contained anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" James finally exploded, stopping to slam his hand on the table. 30 years I spent building respect in this department. 30 years of service, and you destroy it all in 5 minutes of stupidity. The viral video played on mute on the kitchen TV, a constant reminder of Evans's actions. His mother clicked it off, but the images remained burned in everyone's minds. McBride on the ground, the veteran's cap in the mud, the look of cold satisfaction on Tyler's face. "You need to apologize," Margaret said quietly, speaking for the first time since Tyler arrived. "That man served his country. He could have been killed in the war, fighting for the same freedoms you're supposed to protect." Tyler's jaw clenched. "I was doing my job. He was disrespecting." "Disrespecting what?" his father cut in. "Your authority? Your badge? You want respect? Earn it." What I saw in that video wasn't police work. It was assault, plain and simple. Across town, Augustus McBride sat in a community center surrounded by young activists. Despite his injuries, he had insisted on attending the meeting. The room was packed, with people sitting on the floor and standing against walls to hear him speak. "The first thing you need to understand," McBride said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "is that change doesn't come from hatred. It comes from persistence, organization, and understanding the system you're trying to reform." A young woman raised her hand. "But how can we not hate them? After what Officer Evans did to you, after what they keep doing to our community?" McBride leaned forward in his chair. "Hatred blinds you. It makes you reactive instead of strategic. When I was fighting in World War II, we couldn't let our hatred for the enemy cloud our judgment. The same principle applies here." Samantha watched from the back of the room as her father conducted what amounted to a master class in activism. She took notes, absorbing decades of wisdom she had previously ignored. Around her, young activists listened intently, their phones recording every word. "We're organizing a protest for next week," one of the younger organizers announced. "We want to march from the park to police headquarters." McBride nodded thoughtfully. "Remember the lessons of the past. Peaceful protest is powerful precisely because it highlights the contrast between dignity and brutality. When they go low, we go high." The meeting continued late into the evening, with McBride sharing stories from the civil rights movement and strategies for effective organization. He spoke about the importance of documentation, of knowing your rights, of maintaining discipline in the face of provocation. Samantha, inspired by her father's words, began working with the young activists to organize the upcoming protest. Her legal background proved valuable as she helped secure permits and coordinate with city officials. It was a different kind of law practice than she was used to, but for the first time in years, she felt truly purposeful. As the meeting wound down, McBride addressed the group one final time. "What happened to me was nothing new, but your response to it can be. You have tools we never had, phones that record, social media that spreads the truth, laws that protect your right to protest. Use them wisely." The younger activists surrounded him afterward, eager for more guidance. McBride answered their questions patiently, seeing in their faces the same determination he had witnessed in young soldiers during the war and young activists during the civil rights movement. A new generation was taking up the fight, armed with new tools but facing the same fundamental struggles. Meanwhile, Tyler Evans lay awake in his childhood bedroom, his mother's words echoing in his mind. The badge that had always been his shield now felt like a weight around his neck, and the certainty that had driven his actions in the park began to crack under the pressure of national scrutiny and family disappointment. The Atlanta Police Department's press conference was brief but decisive. Chief Richardson, flanked by city officials, announced Officer Tyler Evans's suspension without pay pending a full investigation. "The actions we witnessed in that video," the chief stated, "do not reflect the values or training of our department." Outside police headquarters, protesters celebrated the announcement with muted satisfaction, knowing suspension was just the first step. Signs bearing McBride's image and military service record were held high, while chants of "No justice, no peace" echoed off downtown buildings. Tyler Evans watched the press conference from his apartment, a growing pile of hate mail accumulating in his mailbox. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow officers, some supportive, others condemning. The thin blue line was beginning to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, McBride sat in a local news studio, preparing for his first major interview since the incident. The makeup artist gently worked around his healing bruises, while the producer reviewed the questions they planned to ask. "We're live in 3, 2, 1. Mr. McBride, you've become the center of a national conversation about police reform," the interviewer began. "What message do you have for America?" McBride's response was measured but powerful. "This isn't about one incident or one officer. This is about a system that needs fundamental change. I fought fascism in Europe, only to face racism at home. 70 years later, we're still fighting the same battle in different ways." The interview aired live across multiple networks, McBride's words carrying the weight of both history and hope. He spoke about his military service, about the changing face of activism, and about the need for police accountability. Social media exploded with clips of his responses, his eloquence drawing supporters from across political lines. Samantha watched her father's interview from the community center where she was helping organize the upcoming protest. Around her, young activists worked on banners and coordinated march routes. Her legal pad was filled with notes about permits, safety protocols, and media coordination. "Your father's amazing," said Marcus, one of the lead organizers. "But you know some people in the community still support Evans. They're planning a counter-protest." Samantha nodded, having anticipated this. A vocal minority, primarily from Evans's neighborhood, had begun defending his actions, claiming he was being sacrificed to political correctness. Their support only intensified after his suspension. The tension came to a head at a community meeting where Samantha presented the protest plans. A group of Evans supporters interrupted, led by his former partner Davidson. "You're destroying a good officer's career," Davidson shouted. McBride was resisting. Samantha stood her ground, her corporate litigation experience serving her well. "The video shows my father, a decorated veteran, being assaulted without provocation. If you want to talk about destroying careers, let's talk about officers who abuse their power and disgrace their badge." The confrontation made local news, highlighting the deep divisions within the community. But it also showcased Samantha's emergence as a powerful voice in her own right. Her combination of legal knowledge and personal connection to the case made her a compelling advocate. McBride watched his daughter on the evening news, pride evident in his eyes. The movement was evolving, incorporating new voices and strategies while building on the foundations laid by previous generations. His assault, painful as it was, had become a catalyst for the very changes he had spent his life fighting to achieve. As the day ended, protesters maintained their vigil outside police headquarters. Tyler Evans sat alone in his apartment, watching through his window as people marched past holding signs bearing his name and face, no longer a symbol of authority, but of the very system he had sworn to uphold. The transformation from enforcer to embodiment of systemic racism was complete, and for the first time, doubt began to crack his certainty about who he was and what he stood for. Tyler Evans sat in the dimly lit office of Reverend Michael Thomas, a retired police chaplain who had served with his father. The walls were lined with photographs documenting decades of community service, including several of a younger Reverend Thomas, marching alongside civil rights activists in the 1960s. "I didn't come here to be lectured," Tyler said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Everyone's already doing that." The Reverend leaned back in his chair, studying the suspended officer. "Then why did you come, Tyler? What are you looking for?" "I don't know," Tyler admitted, his facade cracking. "My whole life, I thought I knew what was right, what it meant to be a good cop, like my father and grandfather. But now you're facing the consequence of actions you can't justify," Reverend Thomas finished. "Your father and grandfather served in different times, Tyler. They had their own struggles with what was right and wrong. The question is, what are you going to do with this moment?" Across town, Augustus McBride sat in his study, surrounded by boxes his daughter had retrieved from their family's storage unit. The assault had sparked something in him, a need to connect with his past, to understand the legacy that had shaped his life. In one box, beneath layers of old photographs and letters, he found a leather-bound journal belonging to his father, William McBride. The pages were filled with detailed accounts of civil rights meetings in the 1930s, including notes about police brutality and community organizing. "Dad, look at this," Samantha called out, holding up a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local Negro soldiers returned from war face continued discrimination." In the accompanying photograph, a young Augustus McBride stood with other veterans, their faces determined despite the circumstances. As they dug deeper, more documents emerged, letters from McBride's mother to local officials protesting segregation, pamphlets from early civil rights organizations, and photographs of protests that had never made the history books. "Your grandmother Rose," McBride explained, holding up a particular photograph. "She was fearless. When they tried to stop black voters from registering in '46, she organized a group of women to escort people to the polls. They called themselves the Liberty Ladies." Samantha traced her finger over her grandmother's face in the photograph. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" "I tried," McBride said softly. "But after your mother died, you seemed to want a different life, one away from all this struggle." The discovery of their family's activism history affected Samantha deeply. In her grandmother's letters, she recognized the same passion for justice that she now felt stirring in herself. The corporate lawyer who had once avoided controversy found herself drawing strength from this newfound connection to her family's legacy. That evening, Samantha shared the historical documents with the young activists at their planning meeting. The photographs and letters became tangible links between past and present struggles, inspiring a new dimension to their movement. "Your grandmother was an organizer during Jim Crow," Marcus said, examining Rose McBride's protest pamphlets. "And now you're organizing protests against police brutality. The struggle continues, but so does the resistance." Meanwhile, Reverend Thomas led Tyler through the church's community center, where photographs documented decades of police-community relations, both positive and negative. "Your badge doesn't make you right, Tyler," the Reverend said, stopping at a particular image showing officers and protesters clashing in the 1960s. "It gives you power. The question is whether you'll use that power to protect or to dominate." Tyler stared at the photograph, seeing echoes of his own actions in the aggressive stance of the officers from the past. For the first time, he began to understand that his place in history might not be what he had always imagined. As night fell, both Evans and the McBrides found themselves confronting legacies, one of resistance and pride, the other of power and its abuse. The documents in McBride's study and the photographs in Reverend Thomas's office told different sides of the same story, a story that continued to unfold in the streets of Atlanta. Atlanta's streets swelled with the largest civil rights protests the city had seen in decades. The march, organized by Samantha and her team, stretched for blocks. At the front, young activists walked alongside veterans, their steps in sync despite the generations between them. Drone footage captured the scale of the gathering, estimated at over 50,000 people. Police officers lined the route, their expressions tense. Among them were several who had served with Evans, their badges now feeling heavier under the scrutiny of so many camera phones. Behind the barricades, counter-protesters gathered in small clusters, their numbers dwarfed by the main demonstration. In his apartment, Tyler Evans watched the live coverage, a half-empty glass of whiskey on his coffee table. His phone displayed dozens of missed calls from fellow officers who had chosen sides, some offering support, others demanding he resign. The television showed aerial views of the protest, and Evans found himself counting the police units, analyzing their positioning out of habit. His eyes fixed on a sign in the crowd. From World War II to now, still fighting fascism. The protester holding it walked beside a group of veterans, their military caps marking them as McBride's contemporaries. Evans remembered his grandfather's stories about serving in World War II, fighting alongside black soldiers who returned home to face discrimination. "We're supposed to protect and serve," Evans muttered to his empty apartment. "But who have I been protecting? What have I been serving?" At the center of the march, Augustus McBride rode in a wheelchair pushed by his daughter, his injuries still healing, but his spirit unbroken. The crowd parted respectfully as he passed, many reaching out to touch his shoulder or thank him for his service, both military and civilian. Samantha had organized the event meticulously, incorporating lessons from both modern activism and the civil rights era. Legal observers in bright yellow vests documented everything. Medical teams stood ready. Marshals in orange armbands maintained order within the crowd. The procession stopped at predetermined points where speakers addressed the gathering. Each location held historical significance in Atlanta's civil rights history. At the first stop, outside the old segregated public library, a young activist spoke about educational inequality. At the second, near a former whites-only hospital, a doctor discussed ongoing healthcare disparities. When they reached the police headquarters, McBride was helped onto the stage that had been set up. The crowd fell silent as he approached the microphone, his veteran's cap, newly replaced by his unit members, sitting proudly on his head. "I stand before you today," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "not just as a victim of police brutality, but as a witness to history. I've seen this country at its worst and at its best. I've fought external enemies and internal injustice. But today, I see something new." He gestured to the diverse crowd before him. "I see the America we fought for in Europe. I see young and old, black and white, standing together not just for me, but for a future where power serves justice, where badges protect rather than intimidate, where my grandchildren won't have to fight the battles I fought." The speech was broadcast live across national networks. In police precincts across the city, officers watched on breakroom televisions. In his apartment, Tyler Evans sat forward, unable to look away from the screen. The day concluded with a candlelight vigil outside the park where the assault had occurred. Thousands of phones lit up the gathering darkness, creating a sea of light that satellite images would later show was visible from space. McBride, exhausted but fulfilled, watched as Samantha led the crowd in a final prayer for justice and reconciliation. As the protesters dispersed peacefully, they left behind a city transformed. The demonstration had shown not just the depth of public outrage, but the possibility of organized, peaceful resistance. It had also forced many, including Tyler Evans, to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the legacy of law enforcement in America. The community center auditorium buzzed with tension. Local media had announced Tyler Evans would make a public statement, drawing a mixed crowd of supporters, protesters, and press. Police presence was heavy, with officers stationed at every entrance, their unease visible in their rigid postures. Evans stood backstage, adjusting his civilian clothes, a deliberate choice to appear more approachable. His prepared statement, written with help from the police union's PR team, sat folded in his pocket. Reverend Thomas stood nearby, having agreed to moderate the event, despite his misgivings. "Remember," the Reverend advised, True reconciliation requires genuine remorse, not just carefully crafted words. In the audience, Samantha McBride sat with a group of activists, reviewing the documentation of Evans's previous complaints, incidents that had been buried under layers of bureaucratic protection. Her legal training had helped uncover a pattern that went beyond her father's assault. The audience stirred as Augustus McBride entered through a side door, aided by his veteran friends. His presence hadn't been announced, and camera flashes immediately lit up the room. Evans, peeking through the curtain, felt his prepared speech suddenly inadequate in the face of the man he'd attacked. Reverend Thomas approached the podium. "We're here today for what we hope will be a step toward healing in our community. Officer Evans has requested this opportunity to address his actions and their impact." Evans walked to the podium, his steps heavy. The room fell silent, hundreds of phone cameras recording every moment. He pulled out his statement, hands visibly shaking. "I want to begin by expressing my regret for the incident in Piedmont Park," he started, his voice mechanical. "My actions were not in line with departmental procedures, and I understand the community's concern." From the audience came immediate murmurs of dissatisfaction. The words rang hollow, corporate, rehearsed. Evans continued through his statement, speaking about his years of service, his family's law enforcement legacy, the stresses of the job. Samantha stood up, her voice cutting through his practiced speech. "Officer Evans, are you apologizing for getting caught or for being wrong?" The room shifted focus to her, standing tall in her corporate suit, legal pad in hand. "I have here documentation of 7 previous complaints against you, all involving excessive force against minority citizens. All buried, all dismissed. Was my father just the first one caught on camera?" Evans gripped the podium, his prepared statement crumpling in his hand. "You don't understand what it's like out there." "No, you don't understand," Samantha countered, her voice steady. "My father fought actual Nazis in World War II. He faced real danger, real enemies, yet he never lost his humanity, his dignity, his respect for others. What enemies were you fighting in that park?" The room erupted in scattered applause and shouts. Evans looked desperately toward his supporters, but even they seemed uncomfortable with his scripted non-apology. His eyes met McBride's across the room, and for a moment, the veteran's steady gaze seemed to strip away all his defenses. Reverend Thomas stepped forward, trying to maintain order, but the event had already spiraled beyond the planned format. More audience members stood, holding up phones showing footage of other incidents, demanding answers about other complaints. "This isn't a trial," Evans protested, his facade cracking. "No," Samantha agreed. "A trial comes next. This was your chance to show genuine remorse, to acknowledge not just one incident, but a pattern of behavior that reflects deeper problems in the system you represent." The event dissolved into chaos as Evans's supporters clashed verbally with protesters. In the midst of it all, McBride remained seated, watching silently as the carefully orchestrated attempt at damage control revealed the deeper wounds in the community. Evans left the podium without finishing his statement, escorted out by fellow officers as the audience's angry voices followed him. His attempt at public redemption had instead become a moment of public reckoning, forcing both him and the department to confront the reality that no carefully worded apology could erase years of systemic abuse. The chaos at the community center reached a breaking point when Marcus, one of the young activists, stood up to document a heated exchange between protesters and Evans's supporters. Officer Peterson, a veteran cop known for his aggressive tactics, shoved Marcus hard, sending his phone clattering across the floor. "Stop recording and back up," Peterson barked, his hand moving to his belt. The gesture, though subtle, sparked immediate panic in the crowd. Memories of similar confrontations that had ended in tragedy flashed through everyone's minds. Samantha stepped forward, her legal training kicking in. "Officer Peterson, he has the right to record. Step back." Her voice carried authority, but Peterson's face darkened at being challenged by a civilian, especially a black woman. The situation deteriorated in seconds. Peterson grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it behind his back. Other activists surged forward with phones raised, documenting everything. Evans' supporters formed a line, creating a human barrier between the protesters and the police. Augustus McBride, seeing the situation spiral toward violence, pushed himself up from his chair. Despite his age and recent injuries, his military bearing commanded attention as he moved through the crowd toward Marcus and Peterson. "Son," McBride addressed Peterson, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You're making the same mistake Officer Evans made. Think about what happens next." Peterson's grip on Marcus loosened slightly, but his face flushed with anger. "Stay out of this, old man. This isn't your business." "Police brutality is everyone's business," McBride replied, stepping closer. "I've seen where this road leads, in war and at home. There's still time to choose a different path." For a moment, it seemed McBride's words might diffuse the situation. Then Peterson's partner, Officer Roberts, moved to intercept McBride, shoving him backward with unnecessary force. The elderly veteran stumbled, his recent injuries causing him to lose balance. The crowd erupted. Phones captured everything as McBride fell, his head narrowly missing a chair. Samantha screamed, rushing to her father's side. The room dissolved into pandemonium, with protesters and Evans's supporters clashing while officers struggled to maintain control. Tyler Evans, who had been watching from near the exit, saw McBride fall. The image triggered something in him, a stark reality check of what police aggression looked like from the outside. Without thinking, he pushed through the crowd toward the center of the chaos. "Peterson, stand down!" Evans shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a fellow officer. "Everyone back up. Give them space." But his intervention came too late. The sight of McBride being assaulted again, this time while trying to prevent another act of police brutality, had ignited the crowd's fury. Chairs were overturned, phones continued recording, and the line between protesters and police blurred in the confusion. Samantha cradled her father's head, her legal pad forgotten as she checked him for injuries. McBride was conscious, but dazed, his recent wounds aggravated by the fall. Around them, the chaos continued to unfold, with Evans trying unsuccessfully to restore order. "History repeats itself," McBride mumbled, gripping his daughter's hand. "But this time, everyone's watching." The media presence ensured that within minutes, footage of Peterson's assault on Marcus and McBride was already circulating online. The second attack on a decorated veteran, caught clearly on dozens of phones, would prove to be the tipping point that even the department couldn't ignore. Evans stood in the middle of the mayhem, his attempted apology forgotten, as he watched fellow officers making the same mistakes he had, perpetuating the cycle of violence and distrust. His intervention, though genuine, came too late to prevent another incident that would further widen the divide between police and community. Outside, sirens wailed as backup units approached the community center. The events unfolding inside would soon become another chapter in the ongoing struggle for police reform, with McBride once again bearing the physical cost of confronting systemic violence. In the hospital waiting room, Tyler Evans sat alone, his head in his hands. The events at the community center had forced him to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. His own brother, Michael Evans, had been paralyzed by police violence 3 years earlier during a routine traffic stop in another state. The officer responsible had been cleared of wrongdoing, protected by the same system Tyler had defended so vigorously. Samantha emerged from her father's examination room, exhausted but relieved. The fall had aggravated McBride's previous injuries but caused no new serious damage. She noticed Evans and tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. "My brother," Evans spoke suddenly, his voice cracking. He was like Marcus, just a kid with a phone documenting what he saw. The officer said he felt threatened. He pulled out his wallet, removing a photograph of a younger man in a wheelchair. I buried this truth so deep, convinced myself it was different, that my brother must have done something wrong, because the alternative meant that the system you served could hurt your own family, Samantha finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. Before they could continue, commotion erupted in the hallway. Officer Peterson had arrived, still in uniform despite being placed on immediate suspension. His face was red with anger and something else. Fear, perhaps, of losing the power he'd abused for so long. "You're all trying to destroy us," Peterson shouted, advancing toward McBride's room. "Everything we've built, everything we stand for." Evans moved quickly, positioning himself between Peterson and the door. "What we stand for?" he challenged, his voice steady. "Look at what we've become, Joe. We're supposed to protect people, not terrorize them." Peterson's hand moved toward his weapon, but Evans stood his ground. "You want to shoot me too? Add another victim to the list? How many more Americans have to suffer before we admit we're the problem?" Security officers approached rapidly, but it was McBride's voice that froze everyone in place. He had wheeled himself to the doorway, Samantha protectively at his side. "Officer Peterson," McBride said calmly, "I've faced real enemies. I've seen real evil. You're neither. You're just a man who's forgotten his duty to serve and protect." Peterson's hand fell from his weapon. The security team moved in, escorting him out as he offered no resistance, his bravado finally broken by the weight of his actions. In the following days, the revelations cascaded. Evans testified before the police review board, breaking the blue wall of silence to expose years of covered-up incidents. His testimony, combined with his brother's story and the viral videos of both attacks on McBride, became the catalyst for genuine reform. The department underwent a major overhaul. Peterson and several other officers faced criminal charges. New training protocols were implemented, focusing on de-escalation and community relations. McBride, despite his injuries, became a key figure in the reform process, bringing together his military experience and civil rights activism to help reshape police training. Samantha established a legal clinic specializing in police accountability cases, working to ensure that future victims of police violence would have advocacy and support. The younger activists, led by Marcus, continued their work, now armed with both digital tools and legal resources. Evans resigned from the force, but found a new purpose working with his brother's advocacy group for victims of police violence. His journey from perpetrator to reformer became a powerful testimony to the possibility of change. 1 year later, at a ceremony marking the anniversary of the original incident, McBride stood at the podium in Piedmont Park. Behind him sat rows of new police academy graduates, trained under the reformed system. Beside him stood Samantha, Evans, and the young activists who had turned a moment of violence into a movement for change. "The arc of history bends toward justice," McBride concluded, "but only when we have the courage to bend it ourselves. Real change comes not from hatred, but from understanding, not from violence, but from transformation, and most importantly, not from remaining silent, but from standing up, again and again, until justice becomes not just a dream, but a reality." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Veterans and activists, citizens and police officers, united in the recognition that while the work of reform was far from over, the path forward was finally clear.